Right. Welcome back to Biodynamics 101. There are some links posted in chat for those of you listening live, and for anybody watching back on YouTube, they'll be in the description. If you are listening on YouTube and you'd like to tune in live next time to this or one of our many other lecture series, head over to rosefolk.xyz to learn more. I would just like to let listeners know that starting on the Sunday, the 21st of July at 10 p.m. GMT, we have a study group. We'll be reading the book Theosophy by Rudolf Steiner, so please do come along to that if you can. So there's been a small hiatus with this, but we are back today to discuss the 8 biodynamic preparations, what they are and what they do. Our discussion of the preparations shall be spread over 2 sessions. This week we're looking at preparations 500, 501, 502 and 503. And as always, I'll read us in with a prayer by Adam Bittleston. Measureless the starry heights, measureless the depths of earth, and around us everywhere, light receiving, warmed by wonder, spirits weave man's destiny. May the shelter of this house be a place of wakening, peace within us, peace among us. Amen. So biodynamics, much like traditional gardening, which uses sprays and soil additives, uses something quite similar, but unlike traditional store-bought additives, biodynamics uses preparations. What this means is these are things that you make in your own garden following recipes preset for you, that are intended to expose the garden and the gardener to the 3 realms of nature that you might remember us touching on during session 2, Genius Loci. These 3 realms, plant, animal, and mineral, are used medicinally to heal and regenerate the land we garden, especially land that has lost its life force, healing the earth and reconnecting us intimately with it in the process. This intimate connection is a theme in biodynamics that should not be ignored, as our oneness with the land is surely the whole point, and the first step in repairing the damage caused by hundreds of years of agricultural practices that have drained the life from the soil. In biodynamics, we use 2 spray preparations, 500 and 501, which we mix with water and spray directly onto our garden, and 6 compost preparations, which are added to our compost and then dug into the garden as it rots down. There is a 9th preparation, which we will be going over in next week's lecture, and I don't believe that was set out by Steiner himself. I think that's something that's come later, but so we're just going to touch on the 8 initially, and I'll briefly mention the 9th one next week. So the first of our 8 is horse manure or horn manure or preparation 500, which is obtained by transforming high quality cow manure underground over winter, and it's applied as a spray in the evening. In order to do this, at a time around the autumn equinox, it doesn't have to be exactly, whilst above ground everything is sleeping, we find that below the ground the earth is teeming with life. Fungal mycelium and bacteria thrive in the damp rain-drenched soil. Nutritional values are at an all-time high, and it's the perfect time to imbue some of these rejuvenating energies into our manure ready for the coming spring. So to do this, we take cow horns, preferably from local cows, although they are available to purchase. In the UK, this would be from the Biodynamic Association. And abroad, you'd probably just have to Google biodynamic cow horns and you'd find a local distributor. And you want to pack those tightly with cow manure, removing any green grass or clover as you go. Using a stone to tap the horn to remove any air bubbles and ensure that the horn is tightly packed. This means that the manure will decompose correctly, because air will affect the decomposition process and alter the transformation, so removing as much air as possible is vital. We then dig a hole about 30 inches or 75 centimetres in depth, filling the bottom with some fresh compost, and then we plant the horns, mouth down to prevent any water from getting in, and putting as many as you can fit into your hole, remembering that one horn will... I've got ones that I made 2 years ago. I made 6 and I've got 5 left. So they last a while. And then you backfill, making sure they're tightly packed and covered. And then 6 months later, again around the spring equinox, but not necessarily exactly, we dig our horns back up, we scrape off any earth that may have got stuck to the outside, because this will contaminate the manure on the inside. And then finally, we can tap our horn to remove the completed preparation, using a wire or something if needed to reach right into the tip of the horn to get it all out. You then just crumble that and store it in a jar. It should be a dark black brown, and it'll smell earthy and actually quite nice, which you wouldn't necessarily expect from manure. And I've heard this quite often described as the earth within the earth. So the idea of this is that you're taking all of those energies that are stored underground during the winter, and this is quite commonly known as the time where the earth breathes out, and you're taking that breathing out and you're infusing it into the manure. So then later, when it's summer and these energies are no longer quite as concentrated in the earth, you spread that over the earth and it puts some of that nutrients back in. So in order to spread our 500, we first dissolve it, and the following quantities are for a smaller garden or allotment, but information on larger areas can be found within the links provided in chat or the video description. On an evening before 5 or 4 in winter months, where the soil is warm and moist but not wet, preferably on an overcast and not rainy day, you want to fill a tub, metal is best but plastic will do, with 5 litres of lukewarm water, and into that you crumble just 10 grams of your pre-prepared horn manure, first dissolving it fully into the water, and then we're going to do a process called dynamisation. So to dynamise our solution, we sit for 1 hour and we stir clockwise and then anti-clockwise, breaking the vortex and changing direction at regular intervals. This is quite a good time to meditate or just look at the area that you're gardening. I think that connectiveness with your land is a real big part of biodynamics. So this gives you a nice time just to sit and look at the land around you. So once your solution's fully dynamised, you apply it to your garden. It needs to be almost immediately, within an hour at most. And my preferred method of application for any of the sprays is on a natural bristle brush, like one you'd use with the dustpan and brush. So you just dip it in and then flick it, and you're intending to apply the spray like raindrops onto the soil, not the plants, hopefully covering the whole garden in one treatment. And again, this treatment's just putting lots of the desirable winter nutrients that lack in the spring and summer soil, puts them back into the ground. And as with all of our preparations, we treat a maximum of once every 6 months. Preparation 501, which is horn silica, is fairly similar to 500 in that we're putting stuff into a cow's horn and burying it. But if you see horn manure, or 500, as the food for our soil and plant roots, horn silica, or 501, is food for the visible part of the plants, the shoots, the leaves, the fruits, the flowers. This you bury over summer so that it soaks in all of that nice summer energy from the sun hitting the ground, and it allows some of those energies from that sun to be transformed into summer warmth in the plant's leaves. 501 is a little bit more of a technical preparation than 500 because we're grinding down quartz. It's really important at this point to wear the correct protective gear. So it might be good for our plants, but inhaling ground quartz dust really isn't good for our lungs. So a good quality dust mask and protective glasses are a must. You'll also need a heavy duty mortar and pestle, rainwater, cow horns, and if you're struggling to get the quartz fine with a mortar and pestle, what works quite well is a nice thick, sturdy bit of glass in a sheet and a glass wine bottle. I usually wrap mine in a couple of sheets of kitchen roll or something like that just to get a nice fine grind. So you grind your quartz first in the mortar and pestle, and remembering again that quartz chunks can be really quite sharp, so you want to be wearing protective eye gear. And you need to grind this down into a fine powder free from any large shards or chunks. So using your toughened glass board and a rolling pin or a wine bottle, you can get that very, very, very fine. You want it almost the consistency of flour before you move on to the next step. You now transfer your powder into a glass bowl and begin slowly adding clean rainwater, stirring consistently until you've made a smooth paste. It needs to be stiff, but just at the point of being a bit runny. You don't want it too watery because it's going to take ages to dry. But you also don't want it too stiff, otherwise you're going to struggle to get it into the horn. So you now spoon, this is silica paste, and you want to spoon that into the horn, much like you would with manure, ensuring there are no air bubbles, packing the horns full to the brim. You want to prop them upright overnight in a dry space, allowing them to settle and dry off just a little bit. If any water rises to the top, you'll want to pour that off in the morning and top the horn back up with the paste, allowing it to dry for a few more hours, and then you bury the horn, much like you did with 500. So this time we do this around the spring equinox. So just as you're digging up your 500 horns, you can be planting your 501 horns. So choosing a bright sunny spot, and ideally planting these on a flower day, which we covered in the last session. But sometimes that's not possible because of weather and so on. So any sunny day will do just fine. Again, burying your horns mouth down to prevent rain from pooling in the horns. And then you cover over with soil. 6 months later, around the autumn equinox, at the same time you'll be burying your horn manure, you want to dig them up. You brush the soil from the outside of them, just like you did with the others, and then you scrape the now dried silica powder out of the horn with a knife, transferring the powder into a jar for storage. You might notice a crust at the mouth of the horn or pink spots on the outside of the horn, and this just indicates that the microorganisms in the ground have been at work, and our silica is now imbued with the summer solar forces that balance out the winter earth forces of preparation 500. The usage of 501 is quite similar to 500, but this time we're mixing 1 gram into 5 litres of water, stirring exactly as we did with horn manure for a full hour, and then adding the dynamised liquid into a spray bottle with a fine rose, and spraying liberally over the greens of your plants. We do this opposite of horn manure, spraying just after sunrise as opposed to just before sunset, preferably on a day that is warm and sunny, avoiding spraying on days where heavy rain is forecast. Personally, I only apply 501 in spring to mirror the upwards movements of the sun and the plants. And those are our two spray preparations. Again, there is another that can be used as a spray, but we're going to touch on that next session. So we now move on to the compost preparations. These are different to the spray preparations in that you're adding just a little bit of them to your compost pile when you start it, and again when you turn it. The idea of these is that they rot down into the compost and affect the entire compost pile as a whole. So as opposed to focusing on the plants or the roots specifically, these are about altering the compost pile and its contents. So preparation 502 is yarrow compost, made using fresh and dried yarrow flowers, which we ferment inside a stag bladder for a whole year, having 6 months in the sun and 6 months underground. Yarrow's quite an amazing plant. It can be used medicinally as well as in the garden, and despite its shallow roots, it's really quite tall, and its flowers reach up to the sky and draw carbon and nitrogen through them and out their roots into the soil, regenerating it as a plant just standing there. And it also draws in other elements within our atmosphere from the celestial sphere beyond. As a plant, yarrow holds earthly and spiritual healing properties, and the stag, an animal known for its intimate connection with its surroundings and its highly developed senses, as well as horns that quite resemble yarrow in both looks and their innate ability to act as antenna, transmitting information through the stag like yarrow flowers to roots. The combination of stag, bladder, and yarrow makes sense makes earthly and spiritual sense. The bladder is an amazing focal point for these energies flowing through everything the stag senses. Enclosing powerful yarrow within the stag's bladder magnifies the yarrow's capacity to draw beneficial energies from the celestial forces entering into our cosmos from beyond. Yarrow blossoms in midsummer, so you do need to collect these and dry them a year in advance because we're going to be making this in spring. You want to be waiting for all the flowers on the head to be open. You don't want some just budding, and you need to make sure that you've removed all of the stems prior to prevent puncturing the bladder. You want to dry your flowers and store them until spring. My personal method for drying things is just getting a cardboard box, filling it with some foil so that all the edges are covered, and putting those plants on the windowsill, somewhere where the sun's going to get to them in a fairly dry place. And once they're dry through, you just stick them in a jar and keep them until the next year. You're going to need a lot of yarrow, so it's a good idea to maybe work out now where you can find them. In fact, now's a perfect time to be collecting yarrow, especially if you're in the UK. So just go out and pick a few heads every time you spot some, and you'll have amassed enough to make this next year. So once you've got your dry flowers, next spring this will be, you want to make a yarrow tea, pouring water over just a few tablespoons of your dried yarrow to rehydrate it. You want enough of this tea to be able to fully submerge your bladder, making it easier to work with. Again, these bladders can be purchased from the Biodynamic Association or anywhere else where you get biodynamic equipment. Once your bladder's rehydrated, you want to cut it at the tip near where the urinary tract is and ensure that you can fit about 2 fingers inside of the hole that you've made. This just means that it'll be easier to fill with the yarrow later. Leave it in the tea to fully soak and rehydrate, and then put it to one side and add all of your remaining yarrow to the bowl, allowing that to fully absorb the tea. You want the flowers to be soft but not wet, just ever so slightly moist. You want to compact your yarrow down with your fingers just slightly. I've heard this consistency described before as spongy like freshly cooked bread, and that's a really good description of it. Once it's compacted and you're able to stick it together in balls with your hands, you want to begin to pack it into the bladder, using your thumb or a wooden dowel just to make sure that you're pushing as much air out as possible and fully packing the bladder. Once you've got all your yarrow in there, you want to tie your opening off with some string and hang your bladder in a tree in a sunny position. You want to wrap a chicken wire cage essentially around this to prevent birds or other animals from pecking at it. And it needs to stay in place for 6 whole months until autumn. So making sure that it's well protected from animals and any sticks that might split it is really important. And then, around the autumn equinox, remove the bladder from the tree and take a terracotta pot, adding some fresh compost to the bottom. Place the bladder in the centre of this compost and then cover with more compost. You then want to take a piece of slate or anything just to cover your pot. I find that the drip trays for terracotta pots work quite well for this. Put that on top because when you dig this back up, you don't want to pierce your bladder. You now want to take your terracotta pot and bury it in a shallow hole and leave it over winter. You want this to be, again, in quite a warm place, somewhere that it's not going to get too damp, but it doesn't really matter as it's in the terracotta pot. And again, leaving this all over winter whilst the earth is breathing in. So in early spring, you'll dig your yarrow up. You're going to find that it's very fragile and the bladder might have rotted away, but the flowers should still just about hold their shape. You want to brush off as much of the compost from around this as possible. It will be darker than the compost, so you'll be able to tell the difference, before crumbling your yarrow into a jar and storing it until you do your compost. The way we do this is taking a small amount and adding it to the start of your compost, and again when turned. What this does is it uses all of those healing properties of the yarrow to mix through your compost to heal the compost, so the compost itself becomes medicinal for the earth that it is then dug into. Preparation 503 is really similar to preparation 502, only this time we're using chamomile and cow intestine to make what is essentially chamomile sausages that we then hang and bury in the exact same way that we have done for 502. Chamomile has life regenerating properties. We find that with plants, its roots loosen the soil, allowing nutrients to get in and other plants to root there. And a tea from its flowers unblocks sap and prevents stress and damage from heat and cold in plants. It promotes decomposition in compost, ensuring the correct nitrogen content in the finished compost, with balanced proportions of sulfur and calcium, allowing the life forces released during decomposition to be drawn inwards instead of expelled outwards out of the compost heap. Cow intestines work together with the chamomile in a similar way that the stag's bladder works with the yarrow. In a cow's digestive system, they hold the life forces that promote healthy growth, much like chamomile does in our compost heap. Combined and allowed to compost together, the chamomile draws the life forces from the intestine, concentrating its soil cleansing powers. As it's made in an identical way to 502, I'm not going to go over, go over into step-by-step details here. But it does seem like now is a good time to note that the correspondences between the plant and animal parts that we're using is a pretty common theme throughout biodynamics. During the session on Genius Loci, we discussed quite a lot about how we need to be working together, both with the plants, the animals, and everything else around us if we want a successful garden. That too often planting the wrong things in the wrong places means that we see native bird species decline and we see native plant species decline, and that this has left us with soil that is desperately lacking in life forces. And as that's something that biodynamics is aiming to combat, it's really important that we note these correspondences. And you'll see this as a theme through all of the preparations and all of the ways that we garden when we garden biodynamically. And the promotion of this cooperation between our ingredients has to be mirrored by us in the way that we cooperate with the land, plants, and animals native to our growing site. And this idea again flows through biodynamic gardening, and it's one that you're going to hear me repeating. So that brings us to the end of this Biodynamics 101. Next week, we will be covering the preparations 504, 505, 506, and 507. And of course, 508, which I'll explain in more detail next week. Again, in the description of the YouTube video and in chat on Discord, there's sources to learn more, as well as a link to the Biodynamic Association's website here in the UK, where equipment and completed preparations, if you don't have the time or the means to do this, can be purchased. Just going to ask chat if there's anything. Yep, there is indeed. So, in regards to studies or research papers showing that biodynamics and all these preparations have a better outcome versus the other, I will link you in a little while, and I'm sure we can put this in the YouTube description as well. But there's been lots and lots of studies done. The one that Vaki mentioned about the eggs is another one that jumps to my mind. Another good one is to look at biodynamic wine. So this is outside of the anthroposophical spheres. Wine lovers will oftentimes prefer biodynamic wine, and that's because it just tastes better. And there have been lots of studies done by non-biodynamic, non-anthroposophical sources, looking in particular at biodynamic wine, which gives us a really good idea that outside of our little echo chamber here, this is something that mainstream gardening is getting behind. And I think even if you push all of that to one side for just a little moment, just focusing heavily on our garden and the world around us has some sort of benefit. If you're very purposefully gardening with your land as opposed to against your land, you generally find that things are going to thrive better. regardless of whether or not you're using these preparations. Just let you type before I continue onwards. Biodynamics has changed and developed in the last 100 years, I think, as technology's changed as well. So this year is actually the 100-year anniversary of biodynamics. Again, I will find and link some articles on this once we're done with this. Unfortunately, I don't have internet connection properly on my laptop, and this is using all of the internet to broadcast this. But yes, I'll have a look for you. So it's something that is definitely changing and growing. There's lots of quite good Facebook groups if you want to learn more. And I do think that the British Biodynamic Association possibly, and don't quote me on this, I think that they did something this year for the 100th anniversary, looking at the differences between biodynamics 100 years ago and biodynamics now. I'd really encourage you to read those original lectures, and then read about what modern farmers are doing, because there definitely has been a change. I'll find you some sources in a little while. Has anyone got any more questions? Oh, that's an interesting thought. So this person has said in the UK, silica preparation should be very useful. Here in South Africa, the manure preparation is really needed. I would quite like to ask why you feel there's a difference. That's an interesting. Okay, yes, that makes absolute sense. So again, just reading this out for the crowd listening later on, they've said that because in South Africa they get so much light and their soil is so poor. Yes, in the UK we don't get a great deal of light, so the silica preparation is definitely useful. Are there any more questions, or am I okay to read us out? So the yarrow preparation. Oh, I did think I touched on that. The yarrow preparation is a compost preparation. So we have spray preparations, which is the silica and the horn manure. And then we have compost preparations, which we dig through our compost. So what yarrow does, I'm looking through my notes, throw me with the questions. Ooh, goodness. Might be right in saying I've missed out that part. One moment. So the idea of yarrow and the stag, that's I was linking that in with the fact that yarrow and stag are quite similar in their yarrow with its sort of celestial properties, drawing things in. So the idea of this is that it allows the compost to reconnect with the celestial rhythms that Earth needs. So stag being quite well tuned into these rhythms, and yarrow itself being very well tuned into these rhythms. The idea is that they're pulling in energies from the cosmos into our compost, allowing it to heal sort of spiritually as well as physically. So you will use all of these compost preparations alongside each other instead of one at a time. You add a little bit of each into your compost, and they all work together. So chamomile heals in a life regenerating way, and yarrow is healing in a spiritual way. No problem. Are there any more questions? I would just like to say that this is the most interaction we've had in one of these sessions. I'm glad to see so many people have joined and that there are questions being asked. That makes it more interesting for me as well as, I'm sure, the listeners. If that's the last of the questions, I'm going to read us out again with another prayer by Adam Bittleston. If there are any further questions that can't be covered here, you're more than welcome to at me in the group chat, and I'm happy to answer. And I'll read us out now. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Upon the sustaining earth may we be upright. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Flowers and trees around us. Upon the living earth may our hearts waken. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Birds and beasts about us. Of all earth's offspring may we be guardians. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Light and dark, life and death, in all earth's changes, Christ may we find. And I'm going to leave you now just with a small reminder to nurture what sustains you so that it may nurture you in return, and to cooperate with all around you to encourage a natural, thriving ecosystem. Our next lecture will be the same time next week, 8 p.m. GMT on the 22nd of July. And until then, I'll bid you a lovely rest of your day or evening, whatever time it is where you are. Look after yourselves. God bless and good night.